We are delighted today to have Jim Green here as our guest speaker. Jim, when the announcement went out that we were forming a local chapter, Jim emailed me and introduced himself, and he said, let's get together and have lunch and talk about the ship. And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. So we had a delightful lunch, and Jim told some wonderful stories, and I have asked him, and he's graciously agreed to come and speak. He's going to tell you a little bit about his experiences on the ship. And I'll let him tell you about, I'm not going to go into the specifics, you can tell them everything. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about Jim. He's had 14 years of maritime service, 6 years on the SS America, and 5 years on the SS United States. It's a pretty enviable record. He worked for IBM for 35 years as a sales manager and then a district manager. He's a graduate of Bentley College in Boston with a degree in accounting and finance. He is married, and you are going to actually, she's not here, but you're going to meet his wife later on. And he has 3 children. They live in Valencia, and he's a member of Toastmasters International for the past 30 years. And he's an absolute delight. And when he is done, we have a real treat for you, and it will answer that turtle's question. So I'd like to give a good welcome to Jim Green.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That film was great. It brought back some very pleasant memories. All of you are members of the Save of the United States, so you know all about the history.
I'm sorry, I missed it. Can I ask you just to stand?
No.
Sorry.
What I'm here today to talk about is my own personal experiences, things which people have not heard about, because so many things happen. The ship was a city, and within a city, as I said a long time ago in New York, there are a million stories in this city, and this is one of them. And this is the story about the SS United States. I was very proud to be on the maiden voyage, which was July 1952. It was an exciting experience to be on the world's fastest ocean liner. And the United States Lines decided that they would rendezvous the SS America and the SS United States in the middle of the North Atlantic. And it happened. The SS America was going westbound, the SS United States was going eastbound. As the SS America saw its sister ship for the first time, it blew its horn, it lowered its flags, and the United States returned the compliment. It was a very exciting, it was broadcast ahead of time so people knew it was going to happen. The passengers, the ship tilted a little bit to the left. The important thing, back in the 1950s, of course, what I call celebrities today, most people say, who? Never heard of them. Well, we had people like John Wayne, Bob Hope, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Grace Kelly, Eleanor Roosevelt, Margaret Truman, to name a few. Regular travelers were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, the painter Salvatore Dali with a big mustache, and Bob Hope. On one of these trips, Bob Hope was with us. At that time, in the 1950s, he had a radio show. He decided it would be a pretty neat thing to tape his radio show on board ship, and it broadcasted later when he got back to the United States. So he had the live show, in the first-class theater in front of a live audience. But he had one stipulation. He wanted to be sure that the crew of the ship also heard this live broadcast. So he instructed that the loudspeakers to the crew quarters be opened up so that they could enjoy his sense of humor. Bob Hope, as you also know, was an avid golfer. And the United States Lines decided, since he traveled with us so often, that they would set up a special driving range so that he could practice golf during the trip. The driving range was located on the upper deck between the 2 smokestacks. Unfortunately, Bob got so busy, he never had a chance to practice his golf swing, and all that time and money went to naught. But that's the way things happen. Also in the 1950s, the Catholic Church had what was called the Marian Year in the Vatican. Cardinal Spellman of New York led a delegation of over 800 priests on board the ship for a trip over to Le Havre, France. The longshoremen at Pier 86, before the ship sailed, they presented Cardinal Spellman with this huge cake decorated with a bon voyage. Cardinal Spellman told Commodore John Anderson to give it to the crew, which I thought was a nice gesture. Another very important actor and entertainer we had on board one trip was Red Skelton. And normally we didn't leave Le Havre, France late at night like this one particular trip. And it was midnight that we were supposed to sail. An hour before sailing, the chief person called up to Commodore Anderson and said, "Commodore, we can't sail on time." And he said, "Why?" He said, "Well, we have a problem. Red Skeleton's out on the pier buying drinks for half the crew." It took a half hour to get all those crew members back on board ship, and we sailed an hour late. Now, being Red Skeleton, he got away with it. The superstructure of the SS United States, as you probably know, was made of aluminum. Now, this was a drastic change in the building of ocean liners. The Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the SS America, they were very top-heavy. And when they get into a bad storm, the first thing they had to do was slow down. Because that ship started rolling to the left and to the right, and sometimes it would roll over and not come back. It would just sit there and start shaking. And then slowly it would come back up again. Well, they decided the SS United States with the aluminum superstructure would not roll like other ships did. And they were right. And this ship maintained a speed of 35 knots right through the storms, with one exception. On one westbound voyage back to New York, we ran into a huge storm with waves 10 stories high. One of these waves was so big that it crashed over the bow of the ship, submerged the whole bow of the ship underwater, and crashed immediately into the bridge itself. It shattered all the windows on the bridge, and it injured the quartermaster and the deck officers. They discovered then that this ship had one problem. It was so light that going westbound, where the heavy winds were coming against us, they had to slow down. That particular trip was so bad that we arrived in New York a day late. So we also had passengers, by the way, that got seasick. That's a normal thing. It wasn't unusual to walk up a stairwell and discover somebody's dentures. Mine's the True story.
Jim, was that in November of 53?
I'm sorry?
Was that November of 53?
That was, I'm not sure of that one.
I think it was, because I
I
was
got a
on
bad
it.
memory.
That was when I came over.
Yeah.
I was on that one. Everybody was sick.
Now, most of the passengers, you probably know this, most of the passengers, they had 6 meals a day. 3 down and 3 up. There were also on the ship tragedies. Now, tragedies on board the SS United States were never publicized. We had a socialite from New York that during a storm fell over the inside stairwell railing and fell 5 stories to a death. Now, this happened in tourist class, because the first class stairwells did not have that opening. Now, number one, he didn't belong there. Number two, he was intoxicated. So no one ever heard about that story, and I'm sure the family very quietly let it go by. We also had an unusual amount of people committing suicide on board the SS United States. Some were passengers, some were crew. On one winter day, the deck officer looked out from the side of the bridge and he saw a lady standing by the railing. She took her shoes off and grabbed the railing, and of course then he knew what she was going to do. But before he could do anything, she jumped overboard. This was the middle of the winter, so no attempt was made to stop the ship or even rescue her, because once she hit that water, she was dead. There was no way around it. Another time, on a nice sunny afternoon coming back from Europe, one of the deckhands went into the stern of the ship where the cabin class area is, and there were deck chairs all out, and people were sitting there sunning themselves. And they saw this deckhand take his shoes off, climb over the railing, and of course they assumed he was working on the railing. To their horror, he jumped overboard into the 4 propellers directly underneath. One passenger panicked and started running to the bridge, which is 5 blocks away. Another passenger had the peace of mind to pick up a phone and call the bridge immediately. When the bridge was notified, they turned the ship around at 35 knots in a complete circle, and you could see the actual wake of the ship in the middle of the ocean. A motor launch was sent down, and basically what we had to do was have proof that someone had really jumped. And we were looking for any kind of an object, such as a white sailor hat. As the boat crew was looking, they discovered a white object in the distance, so they went over to it with a boat hook, they pulled it out. It was not the white sailor hat, but it was an Irish linen napkin from the first class dining room. It seemed at the very same time we started turning, the galley decided to dump all the garbage. Well, by maritime law, we could not leave that area unless we had another ship back up our search. Fortunately, there was another ship behind us. They radioed the other ship, and they continued the search to find some evidence that he had jumped overboard and he was gone. Obviously, when he hit the four propellers underneath, he was sucked under right away. There was no way that he could have been saved. In 1950s, we also had television at that time was live. They didn't have tape shows. And there was a program called the Your Hit Parade. It was on every Saturday night, and it was a favorite. Everybody waited for Saturday evening because before rock and roll, they had the 10 top songs of the week. And they had top singers and they had live orchestra. They contracted with the United States Lines that they would have this show live from the SS United States. The company rearranged their schedule so the ship stayed in New York the whole week. All that week, the show were practicing and rehearsing, getting camera angles. And that Saturday evening, live, Your Hit Parade would broadcast nationwide. And the opening credits show the SS United States with huge floodlights bathing her. And then the show itself. This was probably the best publicity the ship had in a long, long time. Now, in sea travel, over the 75 years that we know of ocean liners, there were certain traditions that were met. Number one, the exciting sailing day. That's where visitors and mingle with passengers. And then the ship pulled out of Pier 86 in the case of the United States. And when it did, it blew its horn. All of New York City knew that the SS United States was leaving on another voyage. At sea, one of the traditions that the United States had was hot bouillon at 10 a.m. and on the deck, at your deck chair, and in the lounge. In the afternoon, the English tradition of tea and biscuits was served at 3 p.m. on the promenade deck and in the lounges. We went through time zones. Every day the clock changed, either going eastbound or westbound. Oh, and one of the important things I think which we don't see today also is that in the dining room there was classical music being played during dinner with a live orchestra, the Miles Davis Orchestra. When you entered the dining room, there was always an ice sculpture to greet you. There were movies and there were dancing in the ballroom, not like today's cruise ships. They had gambling. Of course, gambling consisted of bingo, horse racing, and they had a ship's pool. You could go to the lounge of the ballroom steward and you could get a chance on the actual mileage for the previous day, the last 24 hours. And 12 noon of each day, the captain recorded the mileage. And the pool was based on whatever that last two numbers were from. They had a system they used from 1 to 60. So as we all know, that era of the ocean liners traveling back and forth has gone away. It's faded into the sunset. We had probably many, many happy moments on board ship. Before I left the SS United States, one day I was walking along the boat deck. And as I was walking along, I saw this thing fall in front of me, and I looked down, and it was a kerchief. I looked up, and there was a young lady on the next deck, and she motioned to me that it's mine. I went up on the upper deck, and I gave it to her, and I talked to her for a while. The next 3 days, I found an excuse to go up to that deck and walk past that young lady's deck chair and stop and talk to her. Now, my mother was sitting in the next deck chair. Fortunately, she was asleep, but she was the only passenger I knew that could sleep in a deck chair with one eye open. That young, beautiful lady was my wife of 44 years. Now, 7 years after I left the ship, I surprised my wife with 2 tickets for a cruise of the West Indies, a 14-day cruise. Of course, when I got on board ship, the executive purser, Henry Moreno, just treated me like I was a VIP. And people only knew I was a nobody. But the example of that, every night I was on the VIP list, and every night we were invited to a cocktail party. First it was the chief purser, Commodore Anderson, Bill Kaiser, the chief engineer. Every night was a different cocktail party hosted by a different person on board ship. One of those cocktail parties, my wife got to talk with a couple who were at every one of these cocktail parties, which was very unusual because the idea was to invite new people for each cocktail party. And my wife said to this woman, she said, how long have you been planning this cruise? She said, the day before you sailed. And she told, my husband's a jewelry salesman, he made a big sale. Well, that sounded logical. Later on, at the horse races, we won $40. And as I was collecting the money, a man behind me leaned over and he said to me, you people are pretty lucky, aren't you? We went to Bermuda, it was Easter Sunday. We decided we'd take a taxi to the other end of the island. We were told there were artifacts over there that it was interesting to look at. I forgot one thing, that was Easter Sunday, nobody was around, the shops were closed, and there was no taxis. And I looked at my wife and I said, I don't know how we're gonna get back to the ship. Out of nowhere came a taxi, fortunately. So we got back to the ship in time to sail at 5 p.m. that afternoon. The ship's newspaper, by the way, this being Easter Sunday, they also noticed that it was our wedding anniversary, March 29th. So they put an article in the ship's newspaper that Frida and Jim Green were celebrating their wedding anniversary. And then they added, Jim and Frida celebrate their anniversary every year on board the United States. Of course, it's a lie, but it really impressed a lot of people. That was, then of course we got back to New York City, and Mr. Moreno, the executive purser, said to me, I'm going to give you the VIP treatment. VIPs, whenever they were on board the United States, normally most people had the first initial of the last name on their luggage, and you went out of the pier and you went over that alphabet, and the customs inspected your luggage. If you're a VIP, they would put an X next to that. And that meant the luggage didn't go into the upper deck, it went to the main lower deck. And it was the first luggage to be taken off. And those people could walk off, have them cleared by customs, and then they could be on their way before anybody else knew that they had left. Well, Mr. Moreno said to me, Jim, I'm putting a double X on your luggage. Boy, I was pretty impressed. And we got out on the pier, and sure enough, our luggage was already inspected by the customs, and we went on our way before anybody. Everybody else was still standing in line, waiting for customs to inspect their luggage. About 3 months later, we lived in Boston at the time, I invited Mr. Moreno up for dinner. And he came up, and we had a very pleasant evening, and he told me a story. And this story came out of a movie script. You could not, under any circumstances, create this story. And it was mind-boggling. He said, Jim, remember when you got on the ship, I said to you, our general manager, Mr. Devlin, is on board. There's a lot of things I want to do for you, but I can't. I said, that's perfectly okay, Mr. Moreno, I understand. Now he said, I'm going to tell you a story. He said, 2 years before you were on this cruise, one of the bellboys, and they suspected one of the bellboys stole $20,000 from the ship's safe in the purser's office. Because they didn't know whether it happened in New York, on the high seas, or in Europe, they had the FBI, Scotland Yard, and Interpol. Whenever this sailor was still on board, this bellboy was still on board ship, they would follow him, whether he was in New York, Le Havre, or in England. Well, at this point here, whose name pops up on the passenger list for a cruise? Jim Green. The FBI went into action. Remember the cocktail party and the jewelry salesman? He was an FBI agent. Remember the taxi driver in Bermuda? FBI agent. And of course the man who leaned over and said, what lucky people you are for winning $40, FBI agent. And the double X was not because I was of importance to anybody, but because the FBI went through my luggage with a fine-tooth comb. And I'm sure they were disappointed that they didn't finally catch the thief with the $20,000. Because I was a personal friend of this bellboy. He was my bellboy in the purser's office. An interesting sidelight is when he saw the man lean over and talk to me about winning the $40, from that point on, he never talked to me for the rest of the trip. And I realize now what he was doing is he didn't want me to get involved. He knew what that man, who that man was, because he'd been followed all these years. 3 months later, Interpol found this bellboy in a park in Le Havre, France, digging up the $20,000. He got 10 years in federal penitentiary. And of course, at that point, he started singing a song, and he said, "We don't want to let anybody else, we just want you." So that is basically what it's all about. Now, one other point I wanted to make is that I have notes here somewhere. I don't want to forget anything. That's it. So I want to thank you very much. By the way, the film that I took an 8mm film on board the cruise. And all these years I've had it put away, and my wife kept saying to me, "It's probably faded away by now." Well, we pulled it out, it's in perfect condition, and I contacted Mark, and Mark said, "I'd love to see that film." I said, "If you do, please do me a favor, edit it, because I'm an amateur photographer, and I really didn't do a professional job." Well, today you're going to see that film. It's professionally done by Mark Perry. Mark, thank you very much.
Oh, Jim, would you tell about the picture that you brought? And then that's it. Come buy stuff, come sign up, join.
We have drinks in the back if anybody would like.
We're gonna have lots of fun with the West Coast chapter.
February 2064.
I decided to leave the SS United States because my wife, future wife, said, "Well, I think we should leave the city." And I said, "I see." Anyway, the last trip I made, August 1977, I had all the ship officers sign this picture. And I couldn't get John Anderson at the time, but the executive officer was Captain Fender, F-E-N-D-E-R. And for some strange reason, his is the only signature that faded away. So I met him a couple of years later, and I mentioned it to him. He said, "Well, I write all my checks that way." But I'm proudly say this, for a time after I left the ship, my wife's family had a store, and they put this right in the window as a prominent display, and it brought more people into that store just to know, what's that picture? And that's the reason there's a little fading from the sun. But it's signed by Bill Kaiser, the chief engineer, Herman Bueller, the chief steward, Warren Garrick, the chief purser, Henry Moreno, the executive purser, James Berlander, tourist class chief steward, John Sheedy, the chief surgeon. He was on the America and on the United States forever. The only thing he did was hand out aspirin and maybe some cold medicine. He had a great job. We had a full hospital on board ship, and the only people who were in it, of course, were the crew. They actually got sick from time to time. But he had a great job. He had a nurse, too. So he had a full-time nurse, full-time doctor. And then correction, I'm sorry, Captain Fender's signature's on here, but Commodore John Anderson's signature is the one that faded away. So I refuse to accept any more checks from him. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Jim.